I see people coming in pretty quickly. Thank you. If I could just pick on Catherine Pagano, please, for a sound check and a visual check, if you're there.
Yep, all looks good.
Thank you.
Excellent.
We'll kick off just around 12:02 Eastern or so for those just getting here. How are things up there, Jason, with the heat? You guys getting hammered?
We are. Unfortunately, we hit well over 100 up here in upstate New York, which we are not used to. Quite a few power outages yesterday, just from the electrical demand. Fortunately, we weren't affected by that, but a lot of heat up here.
I think everybody's getting hammered.
Yeah.
Give it about 90 seconds. People are still coming in at a
Okay.
pretty good clip, so we'll give it just a few.
Very good.
Here they come. A lot of familiar names. Jason, there's a lot coming in. I'm going to give it just another 2 minutes. We're getting about 5 or 6 every 5 or 6 seconds. So give it just a couple.
No problem.
All right, it's 12:02. I think I'll get started. This is being recorded, so anybody that's here a little bit late, we'll make sure they get the copy. First, I want to welcome everybody. We're so absolutely pleased you could join us here today. We've got about 100 attendees right now, as well as a number of people expecting the recording. And as I had mentioned, saw a lot of familiar names, who's who of life science leaders we were looking forward to speaking with, and a few competitors and partners. And our goal here is really to provide something that you find useful. We want to support patients and elevate the industry. So hopefully you get a lot out of this. I'm Bill McGuckin. I'm the CEO of the Oxygen Group. And as we've built our life science recruiting consulting practice, we have relied heavily on really smart industry experts. And Jason Dow is certainly one of those experts. Jason is the founder of JP Dow Consulting. He has over 25 years of experience in the life sciences industry. He most recently was an executive at Regeneron, where he did some incredible things, focusing on IT compliance, CSV, and data integrity. I can say for certain that Jason's superpower is strategic and practical modernization of quality, compliance, and emerging tech. And really think you're in for a treat with his topic here today. You will see a Q&A here at the bottom. Feel free to put in your questions. You'll also have an upvote opportunity, and we'll do our best to get to all of them at the end of Jason's presentation. And with that, Jason, the floor is yours.
Bill, thank you for the kind words and the very kind introduction. I will do my best to live up to everybody's expectations. As Bill mentioned, my name is Jason Dow. I'm the owner and principal consultant at JP Dow Consulting. And the topic we're going to cover today, a lot of interest in the industry around utilizing AI in a regulated industry, specifically in the GMPs and how that might be possible. And what I'd love to be able to talk through is just some practical tips, some practical examples of where we've implemented this within our previous history for a number of AI models that have been implemented. A little bit about me. I've been, as Bill mentioned, I've been in the industry for a little over 25 years. My focus has been on quality assurance and IT. I've held roles within IT quality. I've held roles within information technology and MIS, as well as compliance and validation. Most recently, I was with Regeneron, but I've worked at other organizations such as Teva, Eli Lilly, and J&J. Have a BS in information systems and an MS in computer information sciences. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about today and what you might be able to take away from it, right? Because at the end of the day, I want this to be as a valuable exercise for you as possible. I've been in the industry for a number of years. I've been on the other end of these types of webinars, and in the past, they're probably a little bit more salesy, a little bit more high level. And when Bill and I first partnered up on this, our commitment and our passion was to bring practical value to folks, right? Be able to get together for an hour, talk through some things that we've done in the past that have worked for us. And if you can take those away and implement them in your area, even better. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about just some challenges of AI and GMP, right? And not necessarily a technical challenge, but just some of the baggage that comes along with some of the hype cycle around AI. And you'll be able to navigate some of those consequences that have come from the AI hype cycle. We'll talk a little bit about AI governance, some of the things that you should consider in your governance program, whether that be policy or governance committee or both. You'll look at key governance areas for accelerating trust through that governance. And then we're going to dive deep into a design qualification blueprint, right? And we'll talk about what that is, what it means, how to implement it, what value you're going to get out of it. And at the end of the day, you'll understand the what, the why, and the how of design qualification and how that helps you to innovate rapidly. Then we're going to go into some assurance best practices. We're going to look at assurance best practices around governance, around trust, around model development, around application validation, all the things that you're going to want to consider looking at as you execute your validation and your assurance activities. And at the end of the day, what that'll allow you to do is further establish trust and credibility with agencies as you're discussing these topics related to AI models. Then we'll go into a Q&A, have some discussion. I do want to highlight, as Bill mentioned, there is a Q&A window you can put in questions. We will do our absolute best at the end to answer any questions live. However, if we don't get to all of the questions, we will answer all of them and provide them to you after the webinar through documentation. Let's jump into it. So what are some challenges, right? The reason that I start with this before getting into the AI governance or the actual design qualification blueprint itself is as new technology is rolled out and it starts to get a foothold in pharma, if you've been doing this long enough, you've seen these hype cycles, you've seen investigators and agency auditors come in and they kind of have some preconceived notions about the technology. And there's a lot of that around AI. And so the entire setup of what we're going to go through today is to address many of the challenges that are coming out of this AI hype cycle within the technology industry. So some of these are going to sound probably familiar, right? Around the hype cycle of AI, we need AI. Not quite sure for what, but we know we need it. We need to implement it. We need to use it. We're going to get value out of it. And so then we ask, okay, well, to do what exactly? Right? So there's this perception by a lot of folks, and you're going to see this with regulatory agencies when they come in and have these conversations and perform these audits. They're going to have these preconceived notions that AI is everything, can do everything, but it's this black box. We're not exactly sure how it works. We're not exactly sure how people are using it, but we know it's out there. You're also going to see some baggage around this thought that AI is magical, that it's mystical, that it's this, unknown, ever present, can do anything that we would ever want it to do. And that brings a lot of what I would say is consternation around scientists and engineering folks who truly want to understand and be able to demonstrate how models work. And then over the last several years, we've seen exponential improvement in model development and in engine development, but the transparency has gone down significantly. So 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when model development and model building was in its infancy, many organizations would share detailed engineering white papers and how their model was designed, how many parameters were used, how many layers were used, what the token length was. And since AI has become so competitive, a lot of that engineering information is now considered intellectual property, and organizations are holding on to that. So we're getting this increase in ability, but this decrease into the visibility in how things are working. And that's going to be a challenge that we have to navigate. So how do we navigate some of those things? Well, what we need AI to do, we must be explicit. We have these AI models that are designed to solve these particular business challenges, and these are how they're used. So we must be explicit in our use cases for AI. Generalities, we put a large language model out there, people can use it however they want, is going to be a very difficult conversation to have with our regulatory friends. And at the end of the day, AI model development, AI use, for pretty much any use case that you would have for AI, magical is not the case. Mystical is not the case. Really what we're boiling it down to is linear algebra and statistics. And you're going to see a heavy focus in the design qualification blueprint that we go through on why we're designing it the way that we are to demonstrate that it is just math. There's no magical, there's no mystical, there's no, put a potion or a spell on something. It boils down to math. And that is something that we can demonstrate effectiveness against. So again, before we get into the actual blueprint of design qualification, any methodology that you're going to use to qualify or validate or whatever testing that you're going to want to do around artificial intelligence, whether that be model design, whether it be use in generative AI around images or text, you're going to want to have some form of AI governance. And depending on the level of models that you use and the use cases that you use, that governance model can take a couple of different forms. And the primary reason to have an AI governance model, whichever model you actually choose, is to build trust. Not only trust within your organization, that people know who to go to, they know the rules, they know the policies, but also establish trust and confidence with our regulatory agency friends. And at the end of the day, your governance is going to build processes, engineering standards, and it's going to set cultural and ethical expectations. And ultimately should instill a philosophy of continuous improvement. We learn, we get better, we learn, we get better, we learn, we get better. Now, you should consider, again, based on the use cases where you're using AI, you may be able to get away with just an AI governance policy. These are the things that we do. These are the things that we look at. These are the processes that we have. But if you start getting into more of the advanced AI use cases, you're starting to look at medical imaging, you're starting to look at process analytic technology, you're starting to look at more automated decision-making, you should absolutely consider the formation of an AI governance board. Okay, and at the end of the day, whether you use a policy or you convene a board, at a minimum in the GMP landscape, you should be looking at setting clear ethical standards and practices. You should be setting clear engineering standards. What is required to demonstrate that something is good enough? How you're going to do your design reviews, how you're going to do your periodic monitoring, and then where model usage is acceptable and where you are using AI models, if you are to determine that they are not operating as effectively due to drift or other parameters, who has the ability and what is the process to revoke, right, to remove that model from use. So from a GMP, I would say investigator lens, right, whether it be FDA, whether it be HPRA, whether it be EMA, any of the regulatory agencies out there, there are a couple of topics here that I've highlighted that I think there's going to be significant regulatory interest. And this is either through having these conversations with our regulatory authority friends or having conversations with other individuals within the industry where they're seeing these types of questions. So your AI governance, whether it be a board or a policy, you should be prioritizing following ethical topics. Where is your model decision support? And what I mean by that is who and what has the authority to make decisions in your AI model use? And this means if you're using an AI model to assist you in lot disposition, is your AI model actually making recommendations and a human ultimately has the responsibility to disposition that lot? Right? That's going to be a very different paradigm than all of our information is fed into a model that's been qualified with a process that's been validated, and we're going to automate the lot disposition process, right? That's a very different risk level. So you want to make sure in your governance program that you're highlighting where those things are acceptable and where they're not. You're going to look at data bias and population representation, right? If you're a global organization, data that you're using to train your model has to be representative of that entire global organization. If you have a US-based office and a number of EU-based offices, training your data on one or the other is not necessarily going to be robust enough for all of your organizations to use. So you're going to want to set those minimum ethical standards there around how you address that data bias and that population representation. And then, one topic that, unfortunately is going to come up at some point, and you just need to be prepared to discuss it, is what happens if you ultimately determine that a AI interface, an AI model, or an AI application is actually going to perform better than the human manual processes that you have out in the field already. What ethical requirements do you have? What legal requirements do you have to then make a decision on where you continue that human manual process and where you may or may not have to implement AI models? And this is going to be a key one that comes up. So the easier time you're going to have with that conversation is to define it up front, not wait until it actually occurs, and then update your policy or governance board to account for it. And that entire ethical topic is going to have significant regulatory agency interest, right? It doesn't matter who the regulatory body is, you are likely to get multiple questions, multiple conversations, multiple requests for data around this. From an engineering perspective, right? Your training data, your testing data, and your production data, how are you managing that? Right? In your traditional model development, you're probably used to an 80-10-10 split of your training data, right? When you introduce validation from a GMP perspective, that model has to shift. That ratio of 80-10-10 has to shift. What SDLC are you using? What model development are you using? Will have to be defined. And then what model verification, if any, are you using? And there's a number of them out there. I highly recommend if you're not using it currently, if you don't have any experience with it, check it out. ASME, their V&V model version 40 is absolutely fantastic as an engineering-based standard for how to determine and validate that your AI model is operating as expected from an engineering perspective. And a lot of that is utilized within your design qualification. If you're not able to, or you don't wish to use ASME, there are others out there that are a little less mature. There is an explainable AI model framework that is available, and you can also run your own custom statistics package if you would like. But again, highly recommend at least checking out ASME. They've done a fantastic job in their verification and validation model for AI. And then, as with anything, change management, right? How are you going to manage the changes to your AI environment, not only from your process perspective, but from the actual AI model and training data itself? From a design and management perspective, you're going to want to highlight any standards or frameworks that you're following, right? Are you following ISO 42001? Are you following the NIST AI framework? Any frameworks that you have in place that identify how you're managing AI in general. You'll also want to look at lifecycle management. Just the underlying process by which you have your stage gates, your approval gates through your design and management. And then any monitoring and reporting requirements, right? Just like we would in any other GMP process, there's the continuous monitoring, there's continuing qualification, there's a periodic review. How do you incorporate the specific elements of AI into those periodic monitoring and reporting requirements? And then another area with significant regulatory focus is going to be on use topics, right? Where is it acceptable in your organization to use AI and where is it not? Some organizations are simply going to draw a line and say, we will not turn over decisions around product quality to an AI model. We are going to continue to have a human be involved, make the ultimate decision. but it is acceptable to use AI in informing them, providing them data, identifying trends. And then, as we talked about a little bit earlier, who has the authority to actually release and what is the criteria for releasing that AI model or AI application into the environment that may follow your existing CSV practices, coupled with your SDLC. But if you have a special process for it, you're going to want to highlight that. And then similarly, who has the authority to revoke and what is the criteria to revoke that? We noticed that there is a performance challenge within our AI application or model. Who has the authority to say we're going to stop using that? So with that said, setting the foundation, let's look at how we can use design qualification as a blueprint to meet a number of these challenges and how we can document them and ultimately support the idea, right? The re-emphasis that AI is not magical, it's not mystical, it's math, okay? It is no different than your normal engineering. It is no different than the normal mathematics we would implement in any of our other GMP processes. And we want to make sure that we're not redesigning or designing something brand new for AI that we wouldn't necessarily do for any of our other processes. And we'll talk through that as part of the design qualification blueprint. So if you're not familiar with design qualification, DQ is basically, I've put a summary definition together here. ISPE has a definition, EMA has a requirement definition around it for facility design. But at the end of the day, DQ is it's there to demonstrate that something, right? And in this case, we're talking about AI models, but in general, it's there to demonstrate that something was designed and engineered appropriately. Okay, and what do I mean by that? We've taken in requirements, we've taken in use cases, and we have physically or logically utilized appropriate engineering standards and requirements to demonstrate that we built it correctly, that it was designed appropriately, and that it was built correctly. It's very different than validation, where you're validating a business process using technology. You want some type of documentation to supplement your SDLC to demonstrate the engineering rigor and the engineering standards that you implemented and tested during your SDLC to show that your AI model is going to operate as it would be expected. And then that will be further validated during the business process validation using the associated technology. So bear that in mind. DQ, at the end of the day, for AI models, you want to bridge your software development or your system development lifecycle with your validation efforts. Okay, we'll see in a couple of slides why we don't necessarily want to try to validate an AI model as part of the business process. It doesn't necessarily fit and it doesn't necessarily make sense. But we don't want to just rely on our SDLC, which is not a GMP activity, and jump right into validation. So DQ allows you to bridge that, and we'll talk through that. So at the end of the day, when we talk about DQ for AI models, it is a GMP document that memorializes your SDLC effort. Okay, it may expand on the SDLC effort around your engineering paradigm, but it straddles the build and the development and qualification phases. Okay, so it's a document that you'll create towards the end of your system development of your model, but before you go into formal qualification and validation. And it's an engineering document. It, again, provides a high degree of assurance that you've designed that model appropriately. You've taken all the engineering standards that are appropriate for it. You've done all of your training data, refinement, and evaluation appropriately. And you're putting numeric information to confidence and probability of that model operating as expected. And your DQ document focuses on 5 of the 7 traditional lifecycle development stages of AI. So a number of these will seem familiar to those of you who have done AI model development. So the 5 lifecycle stages for model development that you focus on within your DQ are going to be problem definition and scope, right? What is this AI model ultimately going to solve? What problem, what business use case? The data acquisition and preparation, right? Where did you get your data to train your model? How did you segregate that data between training, verification, and then ultimately GMP validation? Your design and selection, okay? If you're not developing a model on your own and instead you're choosing a model that has already been developed potentially by a third party, how is that design and selection performed? If you're rolling your own model, you're developing it in-house, how was it designed? What were the number of parameters? What were the token sizes being used? right? What did that training data feed into to ensure that the number of layers that you have if you're using a CNN is appropriate? Development and training, right? How the model, what activities and processes were followed to do the actual development, right? Which standards do we follow, right? That's defined within our AI governance. And what training was done for your team, right? So we're not talking about training data here, but we're talking about training of the actual developers, training of the SMEs that are involved in the process. And then lastly, the evaluation and refinement of that data, right? We very rarely get it right the first time when we're training a model. It ultimately goes through, we do some design tweaks. We might increase the number of layers if we're using a CNN. We might increase the number of parameters. We might decrease the number of parameters depending on where we're seeing our fit to curve. How did we do that, right? We tweaked the model. What did we do, and how did we ensure that those tweaks were appropriate? So why? Why do we want to use design qualification for AI models, right? Why do I believe we're kind of going down the wrong route as an industry trying to validate AI models? And really it comes down to terminology, and it comes down to what we're trying to achieve in each areas of the qualification and validation process. So those of you who have developed AI models or have a background in AI model development, you'll know a model on its own doesn't do anything, right? You have to pass data to it. It consumes that data, it processes it, it gives you a probability or a result, and then you have to do something with that. So you can think of your AI model as a technology component of a larger application, right? You may have multiple applications interfacing with an AI model. So it's not to say we're not validating our processes related to AI usage. We're just focusing the validation on the appropriate place, which is the business process. But we can't actually forget about the model development. We don't want to say, hey, I developed this model, trust us, it's okay, and just lean on the validation effort that you're going to do around the business process. And that's where DQ comes in for AI models. Gives you that opportunity to take credit for the great engineering work you did as part of your SDLC. So why switch that philosophy, right? And we'll use a practical example in just a minute, but we would not necessarily apply the validation mindset that we do for an AI model to other areas within our organization, and we'll look at that. And so many times looking at the past on how we've done something is ultimately going to provide us a better direction than trying to come up with something new that is not going to necessarily get us what we're looking for. Okay, so we basically have to change our mindset. We no longer want to consider AI model as being validated. We want to demonstrate an AI model is qualified and that a particular business process that is using that AI model is what is validated. Because if I focus my validation effort on an AI model alone, I'm missing the people and the process, right? I'm covering the technology, but out of people, process, and technology, I'm missing the people and process. I can demonstrate that the model is operating, but in real world use in my business processes, I may be passing in data that we didn't anticipate. So if we take a DQ approach to the engineering design of the model and allow the validation of the business process and technology on top of that to demonstrate holistically that things are working in their environment, you'll see you can innovate more rapidly and you can survive regulatory scrutiny a lot easier around your engineering standards. Okay. At the end of the day, DQ, we want to be able to provide a high degree of assurance that appropriate engineering standards and requirements were implemented, were followed, and were tested, and that we can demonstrate that that AI model is qualified and additional validation activities can now begin. Think of it as one step or one stage gate within the process. So I mentioned a practical example, and don't jump ahead of me because this kind of looks like an eye chart, and I apologize for that. But let's take AI out of it for a second, and let's just look at the left side here under A, human. And let's use a practical example. If you're in the biotech world and you're making medicine that goes into a vial or goes into a prefilled syringe, some type of biologic. You either have in the past or likely will in the future implement particulate testing, right? You're going to want to understand that after that vial or prefilled syringe is filled, are there any particulates? Were any particulates introduced as part of that filling process? And so let's take AI out of it and let's pretend that a human is doing that. And again, a number of organizations has likely done this in the past. You've probably had multiple conversations with regulatory agencies around this. And so if you think about it, what are some of those questions that you got from regulatory agencies when you were talking about the validation of this process, right? So if we're looking at the first one here, right, a very high level of the process, that vial is prepped, right? At the end of the day, it's filled, it's brought into the lab or it's tested on the line. The lab analyst might shake the vial, hold it up to a light behind a lit background, a colored background, or a white background, whatever your method calls for, and they observe it. And they ultimately make a determination of particulates present or not, right? Same thing would apply if you were talking about visual inspection for color, right, or clarity. But in this case, using particulates as the example. So some of the questions you would get from a regulatory agency would be, well, how do you know the analyst who's performing that test is qualified? How do they know what particulates look like, right? And you might answer that question, well, we have an on-the-job training program, or we have some type of training program that analysts have to go through. They are subject to eye exams on a periodic basis. We understand that it's a very mentally challenging test, so we limit the analyst's ability to perform that test to no more than an hour or two at a time, right? Whatever your requirements are. But that conversation is all about how did you ensure the analyst or analysts are qualified and that they're able to actually detect that particulates were present in those vials, right? There were probably no conversations or questions from the regulatory agency about how that analyst's mind and eyes interpreted the data, how the synapses in their brain fired to ultimately determine how the cerebral cortex identified that floating particulates are there and that I need to write down on a piece of paper or log into my MES or LIMS and document the particulates were present. And that makes total sense, right? It's a biological process, but we do want to make sure that the supporting processes are there. How did we qualify that individual? Not how is the individual actually processing from a biochemical perspective that particulates were there. And so if we look at that as an example and we try to apply a different mindset to AI and an AI model in particular, and we're going to try to validate how the AI model works, we're flying in the face of what we would do for a human, right? So if you're trying to validate a model and you're looking at how it actually analyzed the data that came in for a particular sample, what probability it came with, what it looked at in that actual image to make that determination, you're not going to be successful. Because in that vein, how the CNN in this particular example for vial particulates, how it determined that vial particulates were in the vial, you're not necessarily going to be able to get from the model at runtime. You'll be able to get a probability, you'll be able to get some design information, but you're not going to get, well, I saw this particulate or this floaty or this RGB value at this location, which told me it was a particulate. You're just not going to get it, right? Anybody who's developed an AI model is going to know you don't get that type of data out there. You don't necessarily know how the model concluded that that was the case, but you get a probability and you know it's fitting to a curve. So instead of trying to validate an AI model, which is outlined here in B, right, I recommend, and I've had success in the past, implementing C, which is AI DQ. So it's very similar to what we did with the human in example A. But we add in that the AI model is making those recommendations to the human analyst, or if it's doing it on its own, it'll record that information in the overarching application that's making the call. And so when we have these conversations with the regulatory agencies, if we qualify the model and validate the process, we're likely going to have very similar questions. Well, how did the model know how to determine that something was a particulate or that it didn't have particulates? And that's where your design qualification document comes in handy. You're able to demonstrate how you train the model, how you design the model, how you equipped it to be successful to determine that particulates were present. And then you'll be able to point to your validation of your business process to show, and in production, here were the samples that were put through that had particulates, and here are the samples that were put through that didn't have particulates, and here is how that AI model performed. So you're looking at it in two ends. You're looking at it from a design and engineering perspective, which is where the bulk of your engineering data is going to come in valuable. But you're not forgetting about the validation process, which is now actually testing it in real time, right? Using your production data. So those two things coming together allows you to rapidly innovate at the technology layer because you're able to qualify that model and move on and allow the AI application or the business process itself to validate that real world data in whatever number of runs were determined to be appropriate for your validation. But it separates the engineering component from the business process validation. There's a reason we do commissioning in equipment. There's a reason that we should be doing what would be equivalent to commissioning or design qualification for AI models, is we need some type of element that will be able to demonstrate the engineering capability that we're not necessarily going to be able to tease out in real time during production, pre-production go live. And at the end of the day, I've got a moniker here with the clipboard. This is where the regulatory agencies are going to ask you, right? We talked about in example A, the regulatory agencies are going to ask, well, how did you determine the results as a human? How did you ensure that that individual is qualified? What's your training program look? What is the support infrastructure around that employee or contractor to ensure that they're successful? Those same types of questions are going to be asked about your AI model. How did you design it? How did you utilize your training data? What engineering standards went in there? What level of confidence that you have that that model is going to operate as expected? And that's the value that you're going to see from your DQ. Because when you're able to pull out a GMP document and you're able to discuss and talk through the actual engineering requirements, it's going to establish an incredible amount of trust. And it's going to reinforce the key message that we have to get across is that it's not magical, it's not mystical, it's just math. So, summarized, how does it all fit together? So using that practical example, your DQ report, again, memorializes the effort you did during your SDLC, and it just reinforces that your data and your data management processes were robust in your model development. So if you look at it as a 4-stage process, you've got your model development, which moves into your model design qualification, the document that we're talking about now, the effort that we're talking about now. It then moves into your equipment and system qualification. Because again, a model on its own isn't going to do anything. You're either interfacing with that model through an API, you're interfacing with that model through another application, such as your MES, your LIMS, or your lab execution system, or any number of other systems. We'll be passing data into the model and collecting data and results back from the model. And then that moves into our process validation. So everything collectively taken into account, how am I demonstrating that my people, process, and technology collectively are repeatable, and we have a proven process outcome. So during model development, you're looking at your design and build engineering capability. You're doing true IT development. Your model design qualification is that bridge document between your development and your qualification and validation. And then that's represented down at the bottom there, just the kind of that blended approach. DQ is not fully software development. DQ is not fully qualification. It's that bridging document that allows you to memorialize and articulate the great work you did as part of your SDLC and leverage it during your validation. I have this engineering data available to me. Therefore, the risk of my process is either increased or decreased based on that data. And if that process risk has decreased and my requirement risk has decreased, I can target the type of testing that I'm going to do in my validation, ultimately making the effort you exercise in validation more valuable and less lengthy. So how do you do it, right? What are the practical ways that you can incorporate design qualification through documentation? And so here we see the 4 stages that we talked about in the previous slide, but you see the actual topics and elements that are covered by each stage. So under model development, you're going to see the traditional 7 stages of AI model development, going from problem definition and scope all the way up through monitoring and maintenance, right? You would follow that whether you were developing an AI model for GMP or you were developing an AI model for business use, right? It is your normal SDLC methodology for how we define a model, how we build it, how we deploy it, how we manage it. That is always going to be a requirement. Then if you're going to use that AI model for any kind of GMP purposes, or you even suspect that eventually you'll want to use that AI model for GMP purposes, that's where your design qualification document or design qualification report comes into play. And although you'll speak to all of the elements of those 7 life cycle stages, there are 4 that are going to have a heavy engineering focus and a very robust interest level from the regulatory agencies. And that's going to be, how did you verify your data acquisition and preparation, right? So what verification activities in your AI model development lifecycle did you utilize to demonstrate that that data acquisition and preparation was appropriate? So you're basically verifying that stage and providing more detail of that model development stage in your DQ. That doesn't necessarily exist in your SDLC, right? That may not be a requirement of your SDLC, but it should exist in your DQ to support your GMP qualification efforts. Next, the verification of your design and selection, right? How did you design the model if you built it from the ground up? How did you select the model if you are choosing a third party or a model that's already been built? Robustness of development and training. Again, what is the development process that we're using? How am I demonstrating that the people involved in the process of AI model development are qualified and trained to do the work that they're doing, right? And then lastly, the robustness of your evaluation and refinement. Again, we very rarely get it right the first time. We design a model in a way, we send some data through it. We're not getting the probability that we would like, right? We're not getting the fit curve that we would like. Okay, so we tweak it, we refine it. What, if any, impact does that have? And how did I do it appropriately? How did I ensure that developers aren't making tweaks on their own without there being some type of change management or review process around it? And then when those two elements are done, your SDLC for your AI model development, your design qualification report, I have that in white on the left-hand side because they are distinct phases from your equipment and system qualification and your process validation. So moving over to the right in gray, you start to see where some of these things are verified as part of your qualification. So under equipment and system qualification, pretty traditional infrastructure qualification, pretty traditional CSV elements here, right? You're looking at your infrastructure and supporting technology configuration, right? You're doing your installation verification, you're doing your operational verification of the supporting technologies. And for your AI model, you're using your DQ to prove that information versus doing additional robust testing, right? The DQ is serving as that testing so that you don't have to go and try to perform something separately. And then last but not least, that feeds into your process validation, where you're looking at the equipment and systems, or even potentially the facilities that are involved, the personnel that are involved, the SOPs and training that are involved. And then there you're demonstrating that the process itself is robust and that the process is repeatable. So think of your AI design qualification as proving that over and over and over and over again, that model has the capability of detecting or doing the problem that you're trying to solve. Whereas your process validation is going to prove that in the real world environment using a data set. So training and validation when it comes to AI model is very different than the validation work we're going to do within our application and our process validation. They go together, but they're complementary, not repeating. Okay, now that we've gone through the DQ blueprint, right? And I want to be clear, DQ can be as simple as one document, one report. It does not have to be complicated. You are summarizing and you are elaborating on the technical design practices that were robust, that you implemented and that you executed. And you're taking credit for that great work in a GMP document so that you don't have to try to make your SDLC process a GMP process. So that will just slow everything down. So once you've implemented that DQ portion, or even if you're choosing not to use DQ qualification, model qualification, and you want to use a traditional validation approach, let's talk about some assurance best practices, things that you are absolutely going to want to consider in your assurance activities. And I use assurance to be generic, whether you're following CSA or you're following CSV. These are just best practices that you're going to want to put out there to demonstrate to a high degree of assurance that your processes, people, and technology are operating as expected in a repeatable fashion. So let's start with governance, right? At the end of the day, your governance is going to provide a high degree of assurance that you as an organization are committed to the highest ethical and engineering standards with a focus on patient safety, okay? Although AI model development is technical in nature, at the end of the day, everything that we do is ultimately there to serve the patient. We want safe, effective medication to go out the door every day so that the patients that rely on us are able to have their lives changed for the better. So even though that development is technical in nature, we cannot lose the thought process and the focus on the patient. And that's where your governance is going to come in. How do you blend those technical capabilities with the ethical and patient safety focused mindset that needs to be there? And the way that you do that is through your governance, establishing and complying, right? Complying is a key word there beyond establishment, right? But establishing and complying with ethical standards and legal regulations that apply, right? At the end of the day, if you don't set a standard, people won't follow the standard. Highlighting how you account for that data bias and robustness across your entire population, right? One of the challenges that I had to navigate in my past life is organizations, that have sites worldwide. So where we would look to implement, large language models to help us with deviation writing. You have to take into account data sets that you're getting from the US, data sets that you might be getting from the EU, data sets that you might be getting from Asia. And why is that? Because the writing style is different. And in many cases, it's going to be a different language. Right? So you can't necessarily utilize the same LLM, depending on the data training that's being done, unless you account for that robustness and you account for that population. Again, how do you establish and adhere to engineering and technology principles, right? Who has the ability to say that something is appropriate and designed appropriately? What is that methodology that you're going to use? How are you going to monitor model usage, effectiveness, and data concerns? Right? Again, that drift. How are you handling retraining? How are you handling hallucinations? Right? We've seen those decrease drastically in certain models, but they're still there. How are we training people to pick up on those? How are we training people into the process to make sure that they're verifying data that is coming from, say, a large language model for a particular use case? And then at the end of the day, how do you incorporate into your GMP quality system all of the above items? So from your continuing qualification efforts to your periodic review, to your deviation management, to your change control management, how are you incorporating the specifics that are going to be required for the AI model into those GMP standards and processes? From a model perspective, right? So we talked about governance. Now let's talk about assurance practices for the model itself. And this is ultimately tied to your SDLC. If you don't have a documented SDLC for your model development, none of this is going to be able to be leveraged, and you're starting in a very difficult position. So if you don't already have a development lifecycle defined for AI, get one, right? At the end of the day, that is going to help establish trust in the engineering and technology standards that you're there. And the key to that SDLC is around your model selection. Has it been custom built? Has it been leveraged from a community? Right? You have to be transparent in there. What did we build in-house and what did we utilize from a third party? Bearing in mind that any models that you use, any supporting documentation or technologies that you're using from a third party brings in that supplier qualification, right? So you're going to have to talk through how did you ensure that the individuals or organization that developed that model on your behalf used robust SDLC practices. Your training data, how is it derived? Where was it derived from? What's the split? In a typical AI model development exercise, you might split your training data from 80-10-10, right? 80% I'm going to train the model against, 10 is going to be my verification, and 10 is going to be my model verification or validation. But when you introduce GMP, you are now adding in the process validation perspective. So you might consider a 70-10-10-10 split, right? And the only difference there is you're taking 10 points off of the training data and moving those 10 points into your process validation data. And then data representation, right? Are you accounting for all the irrelevant equipment, environments, sites, facilities? Who's going to use the model? What data was used to train that model? And if I'm an individual that's going to use that model for a particular use case, can I demonstrate that data that represents my area, system, process, equipment, facility is covered within that model training data? Right? And again, where do they go to get that information? To their design qualification document, because your entire methodology is documented there. And then again, model validation and version control are going to be absolutely critical. If you're not using ASME, totally understand, but if you haven't looked at it, you haven't utilized it, highly recommend you take a look. But you need to have something to objectively verify that model development. Whether you custom develop your statistics package to demonstrate that is also perfectly fine. But utilizing an industry standard is even better. So up till this point, we've talked about AI models, right? And we've talked about AI models. They're kind of standalone. They don't really do anything on their own until they're integrated. And this is where your API or your application comes into play. So remember, we've done our design qualification on our AI model, but we still have a lot more work to do from a business perspective, from a validation perspective. And so you may have read documentation, you may have read industry white papers, you may have gone to training where folks talk about auditing, right? Audit trails in AI models. And again, I think it's a terminology thing. You absolutely, at the application and business process layer, incorporate auditing. I sent this data to the AI model. It has returned this response and supporting data. If I'm now going to rerun that, I absolutely need an audit trail of that. But the audit trail is not within the AI model. The audit trail is within the API or the application that is calling that model. So if you have your AI model being called by your MES has that audit trail built in. You need to make sure that it is accounting for the API calls that it is making to the AI model. So this is not to say you don't have to account for these things in your AI usage. It's just not appropriate at the model layer. It's appropriate at the application and process layer. And then when we look at assurance best practices for our overarching business process that's using AI models, the single biggest potential impact of model efficacy is how and what processes utilize that model. And it goes back to the problem description and selection that we talked about. I'm building this model and developing this model to solve this particular use case. We have to be able to demonstrate within our processes that it fits those use cases. I may have developed a large language model to support me in deviation writing, but I can't necessarily say that is going to support me during my annual product review to do queries to support the APR. We don't know that, right? We have to go back to our DQ to determine if that data is available and was incorporated. So you will never be in a situation, or you likely won't be in a situation where you're developing an AI model to do anything anybody would ever ask of it. It just doesn't work that way, right? Just with any technology that we develop. So again, how do you fit that model to the process? How do you fit that process to the model, right? I have this process that I'm now introducing, and I want to use this AI model. How do I make sure that there's a fit there, right? I revisit my SDLC, I update my model design qualification that's needed, and I determine if any additional work is needed on that data verification and validation during the AI model, and I prove it during the process validation that's there. From a process perspective, at the end of the day, if you're not necessarily using generative AI in the sense of that you're generating images, but if you're using generative AI, say large language models, or you're using AI to do image classification, textual classifications, anything like that, you're ultimately going to get a probability back. That tells you the probability of the fit to the curve, or the probability that the text that was generated follows the sequence that you would expect. For different business processes, that probability acceptance is going to be different. If I'm using an LLM to help me summarize a deviation from a documentation and grammar perspective, right, my probability scores can be a lot lower. If, however, I'm using an AI model to make recommendations for disposition or product testing, my probability numbers are going to want to be much higher. But again, you want to be able to define that based on your process. For this process risk, here's where I'm comfortable from a probability standpoint. And then it should go without saying, but anywhere within your business processes that you are using AI, there has to be a moniker, some type of output, some type of flag, some type of flashing light that tells the end user that AI is being utilized. And that, to supplement that, you have to train individuals to be on the lookout for that, to know that they might need to provide a different level of scrutiny, right? If I'm looking at traditional technology information, I'm not worried about hallucinations. I'm not worried about model drift. So I'm not looking at that in my day-to-day. By having some type of visual indicator to somebody that the process that they're going through is utilizing AI, it allows them to switch their mind, the way that they're thinking about things. And now I also have to look at these things related to drift and other things that I might see within my AI model. And then last, but certainly not least, to this point, we've talked about technical, we've talked about engineering and why they're so critically important. We just ended with a conversation on process validation. And where I'd like to leave you here is around trust. Right now, there is so much going on behind the scenes with AI outside of the industry that there is a lot of baggage that's coming in. Trust and establishing that trust with regulatory agencies is going to be absolutely critical. If you don't have a cohesive story, if you don't have a cohesive way of telling that story, if you don't have the confidence in telling that story, all the great engineering, design, and process validation work that you do is going to be suspect, right? It's just the nature of how things go. If I don't trust an organization, it doesn't matter the great quality work that they're actually doing, that barrier has now gone up. So I'll leave you with these thoughts, right? At the end of the day, you have to set trust and establish that trust with regulatory agencies. And the way that you can do that, the way that I would recommend that you do that, is no matter what your journey to AI is, that you document it. Here's where we're starting. Here's where we want to use AI. Here are the things that we thought about. These are the things that are important to us. These are the things we don't have an answer to just yet, but we're going to learn them as we go through. And here's how we're going to continuously improve. So I strongly encourage anybody that even before you get into the topic of a qualification or a validation or a design of an AI model, should it come up, the first conversation you have with the regulatory agencies when you're defending it is, hey, let's take a step back. We want to show you our journey into AI so that you understand all the great work that we did, and then we can dive into your specific questions around AI model development. If you try to walk it backwards, if you try to get from the model development and confuse people and try to establish trust after that, it's a much more difficult journey. If you don't already have it, a cohesive but summary level presentation on AI data management and training. How do you get the data? How do you train the models? What is acceptable? What is not? And we're speaking in layman's terms here. This is not a technical document. It's not a technical presentation that you would be giving to AI model developers. This would be a presentation and a document that you would present to your grandma or your grandpa or somebody who has no idea what AI model development is. Show them the great work that you're doing, why that great work is needed, and how you're demonstrating that it's being done appropriately. And then lastly, a detailed breakdown and analysis of all of your acceptable engineering verification and probability. I strongly encourage you to predefine these instead of trying to define them model by model by model when you run into issues. Okay, the old adage of predefined acceptance criteria and not defining your acceptance criteria towards testing applies here as well. Set the criteria you know up front, and if you run into continuous improvement at the end and you have to update it, so be it. You have the data there to demonstrate it. But don't wait until you run into a challenge to say, oh, I really should have thought about what probability is acceptable, which engineering verification and validation practices are acceptable. So with that said, I'll open it up to some of the questions that we've received. We've got about 5-6 minutes. I apologize, it's going to run over a moment or two. If you have to drop, I understand. If your questions aren't answered now, we have made a commitment. We're going to take all the questions that came in. We will answer them offline and we'll provide them to you at the end.
Jason will also be sharing the video in its entirety as well for those that like it.
Perfect. All right, so let me just scroll up so I can find the first question. So one of the questions here, which strategies have you seen be most effective in overcoming cultural resistance to AI adoption within QA or validation teams, especially when shifting from manual to AI-driven processes? Great question. Very, very good question. And it's something, honestly, that's not just AI, right? We are absolutely seeing it with AI, I agree. But if you remember, probably 7, 8, 9 years ago, cloud technology was very common outside of the regulated industry. And there was a lot of apprehension and a lot of, hey, we're not really sure about this. I would say apply the same strategies that you have for any other technology. And it's helping people through training, helping people understand how the sausage is made, so to speak, right? QA, validation, business teams, they're not immune to, this is what I hear outside of my industry about AI. And what you don't understand, you're not going to be comfortable with. And at least from my experience, when folks aren't comfortable with something, they become very risk averse. I don't understand how this works, so I need you to dot the I's, cross the T's, prove everything from beginning to end. The way to overcome that, though, is through education and training, just like any other topic. AI is not magical. It's not mystical. It's not doing anything differently than what you would potentially see from a human. The processes still need to be there. The verification still needs to be there. The design and verification and validation still needs to be there. And at the end of the day, we're following our process validation processes to demonstrate that it's repeatable and robust. So in my mind, the number one thing that you can do is bring them into your process. Hey, QA manager, we're getting ready to start the design of an AI model, and we're about to put together our design and selection criteria. Come sit with us. Let's see how it works. Right? The more you immerse them, the more they have an understanding of the details and how it works, the better off you're going to be. And that's proven in other areas, right? In my previous experience, some of the best QA people we had to review batch records and review deviations came from manufacturing, came from quality control, right? At the end of the day, when you're a process and a subject matter expert, you know where the pitfalls are. So help your QA folks, help your validation folks, help your business folks who may not have that knowledge and that emphasis in that area understand it a lot better. I hope that adequately answered your question. If not, I'll add more detail when we do the write-up. But bring them in, make them a friend, show them everything, the good, the bad, the ugly. Let them know how you monitor for it, how you design for it, and how you test for it. All right. Another question. You mentioned design qualification to be a step towards process validation. In your view, does that logic apply to computerized system validation? Since FDA and other agencies define computerized system as an automated process, not just technology. Yes, absolutely. Right. So if you remember from the diagram that I showed, it wasn't necessarily a process diagram, but a function diagram. So even during your CSV practices, you're really doing two things. You're validating a business process that utilizes one or more technologies, but there are still elements of qualification and validation that are present. So the pitch that I make to you around DQ is follow that same type of thing. Use DQ for your model design to show that the model was designed and qualified appropriately. Don't try to move the model qualification into business process validation. That's where I've seen a number of organizations want to demonstrate for each run during my process validation. I want to analyze and understand exactly how the model determined its result, which at that point, your model is already compiled, it's already trained. The best data that you're going to get out of that are the results, not how it did it. And that's where you're going to run into challenges. And there are ways to navigate it, but it's going to be a difficult conversation to have. So it definitely applies to your normal CSV practices. Just remember that your CSV practices, unlike maybe some of the other traditional areas where we do validation, is really a combination of computer systems qualification and business process validation that is collectively referred to as computer systems validation. But to your overarching question, you can't validate a computer system. You validate an automated process that uses a computerized system. And this is the same concept for AI models. Qualify the AI model design, validate the business process using that. So it fits almost seamlessly into likely what you're already doing with CSV or even CSA. All right, I'll take one more. Hopefully, folks have an extra minute or two. If you don't, you have to drop it. Totally understand. How do you see risk assessment, risk management applied within the context of AI development and qualification? Great question, right? And ultimately, it's going to come down to what is the risk of the business process, and what, if any, additional risk am I introducing by using an AI model that goes into that? And I won't have what is going to be an hour's worth long conversation on handling risk here. But what I promise you I will do is in those questions that we fill out and send back to you, I will highlight a number of items to look at as far as risk, where risk might be lower, where risk might be higher, but actual practical examples, right? So an example there would be the further along in the process your model from a decision-making standpoint goes, the higher the risk, right? On one end, the model is making a recommendation, but a human is doing something, your risk is lower. All the way to the other paradigm, or the other end of that paradigm, where the model is making the decision or the AI application is making a decision on its own, and there's no or very little human oversight, that risk goes up, okay? But I'll put a whole write-up in the risk areas that you're going to want to look at because it is absolutely critically important. But 99% of your risk evaluation is going to be driven by the business process that's using the AI model. And then what you have to focus on is what, if any, additional risk am I introducing with the AI model and how it operates? Or in what areas am I actually reducing business process risk by using this AI model? again, I want to thank everybody for joining. I want to thank Oxenham for sponsoring this. If you do have questions, if you have comments, if you need help in going through this journey, I highly encourage you, reach out to Bill. He's got a team of fantastic folks that can help. I'm happy to help in any way that I can. Bill will be able to reach out to me, and we can talk about how we might be able to help. Bill, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Jason. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, Jason, so people know how to get a hold of us to get engaged with you. Hey, really strong questions. We'll be sharing them with the people who are in attendance. We'll be sharing a copy of the recording. For those of you that haven't worked with Jason, he has such a zeal and passion for this type of work. And our goal here would be to make it very easy to engage him, whether it's to coach, strategize, oversee. Maybe you have to bring on people and you want to get his advice. Don't be shy. There aren't a lot of impediments to getting him engaged to chat with your team. So you're warmly welcome to reach out to me. We'll be happy to facilitate a discussion. We'll also be reaching out to see if you have any questions about this webinar or maybe some suggestions for future. But awesome attendees, great questions. Thank you all. And most importantly, thank you, Jason, for sharing info on this highly pertinent and important topic.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.